I'm constantly asked, is this the country you were fighting for? That you went to jail for, that you were blown up for, that you struggled over many years working with others to develop our new constitutional order? And the answer is, basically, it is. Not everything that's happening in this country. There are lots of things that I don't like, some things that I loathe. Lots of things are completely unacceptable. But we've got a constitutional democracy. And not just a constitution. We have the institutions defending the constitution, and our people speak their minds. You just listen to any talking program on the radio, every kind of voice, every kind of position. South Africans are not afraid to voice their opinions. So we have the mechanisms to deal with all the things that are rotten, that are bad. Some things are getting worse, other things are getting better. So in that sense, that's the country I'm fighting for. Do we have everything in South Africa that I believe people are entitled to? The answer is no. We still have enormous inequality. We have corruption. We have huge unemployment. We have people living in conditions that are quite intolerable. We've maybe eradicated starvation, but we still have hunger. Maybe we've done an enormous amount to deal with homelessness, with 3 million new homes, maybe 10, 12 million people moving from shacks into decent homes, but we still have millions living in absolute squalid conditions. Our educational system for the majority of people is grossly inadequate, and I could go on with other areas of complaint. But we do have the democracy we were fighting for. We do have the instruments and the mechanisms for dealing with the issues that many we inherited, some we've created ourselves.
I think in a sense South Africa, in terms of how far we've come around LGBTI equality and how far we haven't come, is like every other aspect of South African society. It's deeply fraught with contradictions. And in some senses, we spent the first 15 years of democracy advancing a whole range of rights and in effect achieving them, certainly on paper. And now the challenge is to defend those gains and of course deepen them at the substantive level.
I think we have a very vocal and indeed clamant civil society sector. We've got a very vocal media, a very outspoken, very spirited media in South Africa. I think that civil society groups have been absolutely indispensable to the process of moving towards realization of constitutional rights. I think the departure of Atlantic is going to have a feelingful impact on those groups, and we have to find ways, the country will have to find ways, the civil society groups themselves will have to find ways to ensure that their role can continue.
The partnership with Atlantic has been incredibly beneficial over a significant number of years. The winding down of Atlantic can't but be a challenge to us. I mean, not just the amount of that has been given in grants by Atlantic, but the symbolism of a steady partner like Atlantic Philanthropy has been very important for attracting other donors.
Part of what needs to happen is build leadership, build a capacity for people to generate and encourage the giving from other people. So in terms of priorities, I really would want to see a situation where funding goes towards greater impact, not necessarily in terms of counting outputs, how many schools you've built, how many houses you've built, but more about how many people are now able to generate their own resources and help others to generate their own resources, are able to see what needs to be done and provide leadership in that specific area.
I'd like to see us playing much more of a backseat role with local philanthropy, really stepping up and funding the social justice work. I think it protects the sector. We often hear you're funded by Western forces, regime change, this is a US funder funding this organization. I'd like to see a time where it's almost indistinguishable, because the amount of local funding and the amount of US funding just takes that argument off the table. and where you have local philanthropy standing up saying, well, we are supporting this work. It's not fair to say this is a Western agenda.
So I think our legislation could be more friendly. If you want to establish a foundation here, there are no tax benefits to do it. So I think there's quite a long way to go when it comes to a formal legislative enabling environment.
What we are also beginning to pick up is some sensitivity and anxiety on some of our governments about where the funds are coming from and what the agenda might be. The fact is that it's important to build our own local resources to be able to continue the work that we do. And indeed, in a country like South Africa, and I'm sure there will be examples in other countries as well, there are people with immense wealth. And in fact, that's part of what causes the problems in our situation, where there is this great inequality in terms of income. But those who have generated a lot of wealth, and some of them have done so out of the changes that have happened in South Africa that have created the space for people to be able to make this extra wealth. We need to encourage them to think about supporting others and giving them a hand up so that they can at least be able to be self-sustainable.
Philanthropy itself is often seen as elitist, and people don't understand that you can do philanthropy almost at any level. But it's kind of tied in with South Africa's history, where people felt, for example, the missionaries who arrived in the 19th century talked about philanthropy. But the way things were in those days, they were terribly patronizing to the communities where they handed out their philanthropy. And there's always been this resistance, I suppose, in South Africa and a lot of communities to this concept of philanthropy. However, if we look back, what those same missionaries did, they built the most incredible schools. They were involved in the anti-slavery movement. So although the philanthropy might have been patronizing, it achieved quite a lot of substantial gains. And I think we need to get people to really understand that modern philanthropy is something completely different. It's moved away from a charitable paradigm, and that it's about strategic shifts in our society. And I think once people understand that, the view of philanthropy will change. But I think there's still that sense that somehow philanthropists are all the rich people who are doing favors for the poor.
My greatest concern as a grant maker in South Africa is that as South Africans, or as people living in South Africa who are committed to our country, who are committed to our democracy, committed to our constitution, we have to find a way to ensure that each one of us contributes towards building a strong civil society. You can only rely on international donors and wealthy local philanthropists or regional philanthropists up to a certain point. There has to be a point at which, if South Africans are interested in a free media, you have to find a way to support it yourself. If you're interested in the right to education, then you have to start supporting local causes. And I think that over time, the ruling party and the opposition party will understand that civil society is actually not a threat to their political power. It's just a check on their political power. And one would hope that eventually they would understand the rationale for people with a lot of money actually giving their money away to very good causes, and not just to faith-based giving, but actually to social justice activism.
If structured properly, civil society could be sustained totally locally, if we kind of do the right things, nurture, unlock, educate, and do all of these things. And I think it is important for civil society to be funded locally, so that it's independent, and funding from individuals provides that independence, and I think it also is reflective of the wishes of citizens, so it will be areas that citizens are connected to and are engaged in. Yeah.
One of the things we've revealed, certainly something I feel I've learned in the last decade or more, is about a new way of organising the world, which will deliver quality social services to poor people that will, I believe, lead to development, including economic development. And that new way of organising the world is about how do you build accountability at every level of government, and how do you give the citizen, and I mean citizen broadly, I don't just mean the person who carries a passport in South Africa, how do you give the citizen the power to know what government should give to him or her, what is their relationship, and what is their relationship with private power. You know, I've been doing this for, God, nearly 20 years. I never expected it to be that long. But now I feel as if my eyes are open. Give us another 20 years. I'm not saying this to Atlantic, but give us another 20 years to keep doing this. Then I think we're beginning to get a key that can fix many of the social problems that face our continent and poor people more widely across the globe. And so for me, you know, that shows that this combination of people's power on the ground with constitutional litigation in the context of our empowering constitution can deliver. And really, I think the challenge that we face for the future is how do you replicate that in 10,000 clinics and schools and so on and so on? How do you help to build a population that knows its rights, that has access to the law, that knows how to use the law to fix its immediate environment? And really that's the definitive question of the next few years, really, because the problems remain, although are of a different nature.
My vision for social justice giving and my vision for what donors should be doing is you've got to build a movement of people, a political movement of people that are mobilized, that are able to do a number of things. One, to articulate what their concerns are in constitutional manner, you know, through legal means. And then two, to demand those rights using evidence and using research and using advocacy and using litigation, either from government, who's supposed to provide those services, or either from the private sector.
And the real issue is that the citizenship increasingly is holding power structures to account. And that should be the case in a democracy. And many people who are in positions of power don't like that and would rather not be held accountable. So I think that tension between formal political power and the political power in civil society on the ground is a very important tension going forward. And I think what we need is to build civil society. We need people to invest in civil society movements, regardless of their shape and size. We need philanthropists to come on board, particularly local philanthropists, and play their part in building such a movement. And we need a vibrant citizenry. Of course, ideally, one wants to build a broad-based social movement that takes on a range of issues related to social justice. But I think it's equally important to have a diverse civil society, to have different kinds of formations of groupings, whether it's groupings that are focused specifically on lobbying, whether it's grassroots organizations that are interested in community mobilization. What we really want is to diversify the activist and the civil society field, if you like, and to build active citizenry across the board. And I think one way to do that is to try and build the concept of social justice philanthropy.
Our continent is, for the first time in a long, long time, poised for very significant, sustained economic growth, the emergence rapidly of a middle class across the continent. We have levels of education that the continent has not seen for a very long time. We have a burgeoning population of young, educated, unfortunately unemployed, mostly young people who are thinking afresh about social issues, about social transformation, who are hungry for social formations that they can identify with and align themselves to. And so those who are involved in the field of philanthropy as Africans today need to be thinking in a 50-year horizon. And that is really what the Other Foundation is about. It's putting in place that institutional architecture that we hope in the long term can see this emerging generations of people taking responsibility to change their own social environment, taking responsibility for our own social problems rather than expecting that somebody else from overseas is going to come and fix it for us.
Well, if it were up to me, South Africa should be fully self-funding in 20 years' time, so that, civil society does not depend on, external funders. And it is actually possible. It's just that right now I don't think the money that's there and that's available is being channeled in the right ways. And I don't think we are sufficiently taking advantage of people's willingness to give.
I think that now is the time where people finally are able to see the value of a democracy, the value of preserving a democracy, and the value of actually paying for it for themselves. So one of the issues that we're dealing with right now is everybody wants a free and independent media, but nobody wants to pay for it. And you can't, for indefinitely rely on international donors and international individual philanthropists to fund the very safeguards of a democracy that you would like to enjoy, whether you're a person who's Indian or white or colored or African. The point is, we're now at that stage where everybody realizes what we actually fought for, what we should be preserving. And I think now people's perceptions and attitudes are changing towards why it's important to give money beyond just providing for basic humanitarian supplies. I think people are finally understanding why an independent media, or funding an independent media, or funding public interest litigation, or funding the rights advocacy for sex workers or LGBTI groups is as important as providing toilets for school children, or providing a creche for abandoned or orphaned children. I think that what we've been able to do with very limited resources is create meaningful, lasting impacts. I hope that philanthropic giving can be rooted in a desire to have a democracy that actually works for everybody, not just for an elite, or not just for people who have political or business connections. And I hope that philanthropists, including your big local and international donors, are able to work in a more collaborative fashion.